Gabriel, you should see live in about 1, 2, 3, and we are live. All right.
Wonderful. We just need a little on-air light, you know those things, have it behind your head, and when it goes, I'll jump in. Great. Welcome, everybody, to this week's eNoam session. Glad to be here with you in this lovely month of June. That would be the Gregorian calendar. What's the, Kim, what's the month in the Hebrew calendar?
I think we just came into,
Tammuz.
Yeah. There we go.
See, that's why Tammuz a couple of days ago.
That's why we never meet Yonatan. I just, so before we get started, I just want to welcome all of you to eNoam. We are friends and family here, and it's a mixed group. We have Christians and Jews spread out over the world from, we got Canada. Do we have anyone? No one's in the, yes, Pastor Sylvia and Dean are in the USA today. We've got Israel, we've got Africa. We just need to spread out a little bit more, I think. We're not trying hard enough. And we're here because we love the Hebrew scriptures. We love the Bible, and we celebrate them, and we love Israel. And we can come together and study the Torah together. Rav Johnny's going to be working through some of that with us, and we're so thankful that you're here and willing to do that, Johnny. And but we also recognize we have differences, religious differences, Christians and Jews. There's certain elephants in the room we don't agree with each other upon, and in this group, we consider that it's okay to let those differences exist, and we get along pretty well. So today we're going to be talking about humility. So I'm going to try to talk less and let Rav Johnny talk a little bit more. That's my act of humility, and let's have some fun.
Okay.
Okay, so thank you for that lovely and warm introduction. It's so great to be with all of you. And as Gabriel said, what we're going to be discussing today is the trait, the Middah of humility, which in Hebrew is called anava. So what I'd like us to do is explore two particular biblical texts and a range of other rabbinic texts, which are most of those commentaries on those biblical texts. But together, and I want to stress together, this isn't a lecture, it's a class in which we can learn and grow from one another. Together, try and understand what is this trait of humility, which the Bible encourages us, urges us to pursue and to develop. So let's begin. And we begin by identifying the two major verses we're going to be exploring. In previous sessions, we've looked at many biblical texts. Here we're going to look at just two, because these two really become the headlines of our conversation. One relating to humility as expressed in a person, the great leader of the Bible, Moses, and the other, humility as expressed by a trait that we are all urged, as I say, to develop, to foster. And so we're going to be looking at the book of Numbers, Bamidbar, and the book of Proverbs, Mishlei, and in between a few other things. Let's begin with one of those other things. Some of the books I'm going to be quoting to you may be familiar to you, some not. They come from the wide range of Jewish teachings around the Bible, as I say, from ethicists primarily over the last 800 years. And we begin with a citation from a book which is less well known. It's a mystical book called Tomer Dvorah, the palm tree of Dvorah, inspired by the story of Dvorah in the book of Judges. But this is in fact a mystical book exploring midot, traits. And it's written by Moses ben Jacob Cordovero in the 16th century. And he begins his book, well, certainly early on in his book, the Rabbi Moses ben Jacob Cordovero, sometimes known by the name Ramak, because Ra represents rabbi, and M represents Moses, and K represents Cordovero. So the Ramak, in his book, Tomer Dvorah, begins by telling us that the Middah, the trait of humility, is a key to all character development. Meaning, if you had a pyramid of Midot, what is the foundation of all? What is the quality? What is a trait that we all need to develop all other traits? He says it is humility. In fact, by the way, he's not speaking just for himself. The biblical tradition and the rabbinic tradition emphasize humility as a prerequisite for revelation. They say that when the Israelites came to Mount Sinai, they did so with a sense of humility. Afterwards, that was perhaps less expressed. They came so with a sense of humility. In fact, they went so far as to say that Mount Sinai was a lower mountain. It's not one of the high mountains of the area, which demonstrates how revelation occurs on a place which itself is humble. And so before we proceed and look at the stories from the book of Numbers, from the book of Proverbs, it's important to emphasize how humility is the Middah of all Middot, the trait of all traits, the foundation of everything. It's a prerequisite to being able to be called upon by God, because God expects us to be humble. If a person is arrogant, then they think they're great. If a person's humble, they know that they can grow to become great. And so humility, anava, is essential. And just before I open the floor, because I'd love to hear your thoughts, unfortunately, humility is one of those traits that seems to be less emphasized in the modern period of time. It's one of those qualities that people spoke about in bygone eras, in earlier times, in previous generations. But if you tell a young person you need to foster a sense of humility, they may well say, what are you talking about? And what do you know anyway? But that itself really speaks volumes. Humility is an absolute basic for any seeker of any faith, because by being humble, we allow ourselves to be molded by the will and want of God. We allow ourselves to be built up by the commands, by the ethics, by the virtues of God. A person who thinks they have it all doesn't heed to the word of another because they think they have all the wisdom inside them. It's only a person who's humble, who turns to another, recognizing there is from which to learn from others. And so before we go on, I humbly offer to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts about how you see the trait of humility in the hierarchy of other traits. Do you see it as Moses ben Jacob Cordovero as being the foundation of foundations, a traitable traits? Do you see humility as being the absolute basic ingredient for somebody who is a seeker? Perhaps you don't, for that matter. But before we go on, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Anybody with any thoughts about this statement or things I've said just now?
Well, I would certainly agree that humility is a good foundation stone. First off, there's kind of a light thought here, is that Moses was the one that wrote down Numbers, and here he is declaring himself the most humble man of all time. I had to have a little chuckle at that. Mm-hmm. But on a more serious note, I've thought that hero worship is often really destructive to the person who's being worshipped. That God alone is to be worshipped.
Yes.
And so humility there is a very important character trait, so that we don't become corrupted. So those are my initial thoughts.
I agree with both. In fact, according to rabbinic tradition, one of the reasons we don't know the burial place of Moses is that so we don't worship the person and don't confuse what we can be versus what God truly is. And so here, humility being the foundation of everything is essential. Interestingly, as you mentioned, about the book of Numbers, question, about authority and authorship, revelation. But the fact that humility is mentioned there is the essential quality of the leader is, I think, quite remarkable. It doesn't say Moses was the most eloquent. We know he wasn't. It doesn't say that he was the smartest, although he certainly was very smart. When you think about the menu of qualities that we often use to celebrate somebody, we would rarely put humility as a number one trait. If, for example, somebody was giving dating advice to somebody, would you first say, look for somebody who's humble? I would say we may not do so, but we probably should. Imagine how the world would be when the people we seek, the people we hire, those we work with, the number one thing we're looking for isn't brash arrogance, but instead a sense of humility. And I think that's something which is, again, underemphasized in the modern period and strongly emphasized in the biblical period. And one of the reasons we're talking today is to review and to reconnect with those values of then, remind ourselves of their presence in our lives and the importance of them being present in the lives of those around us. Any quick thoughts about this before we move on to some biblical texts and other texts?
One thing that I was thinking was that humility is something that redirects your view outward instead of inward. And C.S. Lewis once said that humility isn't thinking less of yourself, but it's thinking of yourself less.
Yes, beautiful.
And it's a word saying a humble person is looking out to see what they can do to make the world better for the people around them and for the situations around them, rather than trying to build themselves up and give themselves everything.
100%. That's I think absolutely so very much on the point. We're going to see a quote very similar to that of C.S. Lewis. And yes, humility is about what we aren't yet and also what we can do for others. Humility is really the basis of servant leadership. It's a basis of being a servant of God, of being somebody who's prepared to heed the call of God. And as I say, it's an essential quality. It's one in which a person isn't caught up by their own personal, professional, spiritual resume. Instead, they ask themselves what they can do for others. They ask themselves what they can learn from others. And that's why true growth comes from humility, because only somebody who's humble is prepared to learn from all around them. It's only somebody who's foolish enough to think they know all that they need to know, which limits them from their own growth journey. Okay, well, with that in mind, let's have a look at one of the two biblical verses that I identified earlier on, the one here in this case referring to Moses. And ironically, it's when referring to Moses's private life, shall we say, his married life, his relationship, it's here where this quality is highlighted. You know, strangely enough, great leaders often put aside their personal life because they're dedicating their life to others. But it's in this chapter where a window is given to Moses' personal life by those around him, Miriam and Aaron, his brother and sister. It's only then when we're reflecting on who Moses is as an individual, not as a leader of the nation, that this powerful, remarkable biographical portrait is offered in a singular verse, which tells us so much about Moses and tells us so much also about what we need to be in order to emulate Moses, in order to also be servants of God. And here we're told about the absurd criticism or improper criticism of Moses in terms of his separation from his wife, which we're not going to go into now. They said in verse 2, has the Lord spoken only to Moses? Hasn't he spoken to us too? Meaning, why does Moses act differently to us? And this is Miriam and Aaron speaking. And the Bible itself almost answers that question, because Moses was somebody who was prepared in many ways to have less for himself, to give more to others. Because Moses was prepared to do with less, so he could be there more for others. We're told here, now this man Moses was exceedingly humble. more so than any other person on the face of the earth. What an accolade. What a testimony that Moses, perhaps compared to other aspects in terms of prophecy, in terms of wisdom, maybe they were greater. But in terms of humility, in terms of this quality called anav, he was anav me'od, he was very great. And this highlights how he had, as I say, shaped himself, molded himself, presented himself, made himself available to do whatever God had asked him to do. And sometimes that's what God expects of us as well. God calls upon us, and rather than us saying, I'm busy, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, our task is to echo the words of the great biblical leaders and say, here I am, or in Hebrew, hineni. Here I am, ready to do whatever you ask me to do. That itself is humility. However, what I'd like to do is try and understand a little bit more behind this verse. How does one foster humility? Isn't that an interesting question? I mean, are you hardwired to be humble? Are some of us more naturally humble than others? That may be the case. How does one try and tread those same steps of Moses? How does one try and emulate somebody like him and be more humble? If, of course, one could speak about some kind of hierarchy of being more humble, which itself, of course, is ridiculous. And I'd like to give you two answers. One is the obvious one, and one is most certainly not the obvious one. The obvious one is to reflect on God. Because the more we reflect on God, the more we recognize how small we are. And though we can do great things, and we'll get to that soon, we certainly need to recognize that in the shadow of God, we are small, and this should make us humble. This should foster fear of God. And with that in mind, I want to tell a brief story. It's actually a very quaint story, but it's one which not only have I thought about, but I've actually used in my teaching many times. In the 1950s in Israel, works were being done to put street lamps in the few cities that existed at the time. And one of the cities that existed at the time was a place called Bamidbar. And in Bamidbar was one of the great Torah leaders of the time, known as the Hazon Ish, Avram Yeshaya Karelitz. Anyway, so this old saintly figure is living in an apartment in Bamidbar, and just outside, an innovation is happening. Street lamps are being built. Until that point, it was dark at nighttime. And he had a whole bunch of students, and his student said, Hazon Ish, what do you think about these great street lamps? Isn't it great? And he said something so wise. He said, when you're far away from the street lamp, your shadow is big. When you're under the street lamp, your shadow is small. He said it's the same with spirituality. Often people who are far from God think they're so great. The true great in terms of spirituality, the ones who are near the light, recognize how small they are. Ironically, you measure the greatness of a person by how humble they are, not how self-effacing, not how dismissive they are of what they do, but by how humble they are. And I thought this was such a great remark. The nearer you are to the light, the smaller your shadow. And I'll tell you a quick story about that, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts, and we'll go on to hear a fascinating rabbinic teaching. I teach in post-high school schools in Israel, where students have finished high school in States, in Canada, they come to Israel, they study, and I teach them in a number of those kind of places. And a student of mine, a female student, had been in school for 1.5 years, which is longer than many. And she was soon planning to go back to Denver, where she lived. And we were walking just near the building of the institution. And she said, Rav Johnny, I don't think I've learned a thing. I said, what do you mean? She said, I've been here for 1.5 years. I don't think I know anything. I said to her, I am so proud of you. And she looked at me like I was crazy. Like, I've just told you, I think I've failed the last 18 months of my life, and you're praising me. I said, let's just walk a little bit more. We walked a few meters. It was around about 6 in the evening, starting to get dark, and there was a street lamp there. And a few meters away from the street lamp, I said, look at your shadow. I said, is it big or small? She said it was big. And then we went nearer the light. I said, is it big or small? She said, it's small. I said, that's you now. You now are somebody who realizes what it means to be close to God, that you are humble about what you know. You've grown precisely because you're able to say that. When you arrived, you think you knew so much. Now you've fostered humility, and yet actually you're so much more learned. And I told them how proud I was of them. This is what humility is. It's closeness to God, and yet a recognition through that closeness of who we are, but also, as I say, what we can achieve. So before we go on to our next source, any thoughts about what I've just shared, or about this verse, for example? Any thoughts emerging from this verse that you'd like to share? If that's the case, I'm going to show you one of the most remarkable and admittedly controversial rabbinic stories relating to the humility of Moses.
Johnny, can I ask one question just
Feel
before
free,
you?
yeah, go for it.
Sorry.
Lovely.
I don't want to break your flow here.
That's all good.
It's just the fact that this was said in response to criticism, right? That he was being asked. I guess maybe just before we get to that, I find that the definition of humility is a challenging one.
Yeah.
You can ask, like, in this, we have a group of, it looks like we've got about 17 people, probably 18, 19, and we all probably have a different background of a concept of humility, different experiences of what other people that we define as humble as being. And I remember one time in a kind of a job interview, someone asked me if I was a proud person. And I said no. And then he immediately looked at me and said, that means you're proud. And I,
said,
yeah.
no, you are. If you are.
If you don't know you're proud, then you are proud. He was kind of, he was teasing me a little bit, but and the point there being was just like, I feel like we need examples of what humility is in order to understand what humility is. Like, the word on its own has no meaning.
I hear that. And what we're going to do is try and work through with some insights. I kind of agree we need examples, but I also kind of agree that humility is a deeply personal thing. What we're going to emphasize, and as was mentioned before, and so beautifully by Ruth, humility isn't the rejection or the dismissing or the ignoring of a person's qualities. In order to be humble, you need to know what you can do and be, but not flaunt it. It's not about disregarding who you are. It's not presuming that you are the of anything, but making peace with who you are, but in tandem with your relationship with God. So a person can be really, really good at something, and they need to know that they're good at it. They also need to know that they're a servant of God, and that keeps them in check. That's how I understand humility, but I agree. Different people have different definitions. I suspect through some of the sources, we'll encounter a variety of definitions that some of us haven't yet thought of, and I'd love to hear people's reactions to them. Still, the Bible itself doesn't give us a working definition, which is the very interesting thing. It doesn't tell us what this means. And especially from the context here, it's curious. Like, if I were to merely just look at these verses, I'd say humble means perhaps a little bit naive. Again, not for trying to speak improperly about Moses, but you could think that perhaps based on the verses. I don't think that to be true. We're left in many ways to figure that out for ourselves. I think that's part of the divine challenge. Figure out what it means for you to be humble. But let's see in the story we're about to read, because I think it's going to surprise many of us. It certainly did the moment I first read it. But before we do that, let's look at the chat, because we have a remark. It would appear that Miriam and Aaron were lacking humility, as their comment suggests that God could not possibly talk to someone else, not to them. I think perhaps that's a brilliant insight. Maybe the humility is not questioning God. The person who questions God themselves already thinks that they are on par. I believe, as I say, humility is all about the human divine encounter. Not so much me, myself, and I. It's about me, myself, and I in terms of me and my Creator. Now, I was mentioning that there are, well, basically the Jewish tradition is a biblical tradition. They also have a rabbinic tradition. But even within the rabbinic tradition, there is generally authoritative teachings. But once in a while, there's a story or an insight which many people disagree with. They feel is either fictional or they feel it's somehow developed over time and it isn't reflective of the broad rabbinic ethic. The story we're going to read now is one of those controversial aspects of it. And yet it's so fascinating that it still deserves us looking through. And it's found in a relatively modern commentary on the Mishnah called Tiferet Yisrael. Doesn't really matter. It's apparently an ancient rabbinic teaching, although we don't have any record of it anywhere else. But still, as I say, it's so significant. I'd like to share it with you. And it goes as follows. There's a great story about Moshe Rabbeinu Moses, our master's merit, recorded in the commentary Tiferet Yisrael on the Mishnah. Okay. When Moses brought the Jews out from Egypt, all the nations heard and trembled. And they wondered greatly concerning this man, Moses, who by his hand had so many miracles were wrought. Meaning, the talk of the Middle East was, who is this guy who took this small nation out of this leading power called Egypt? Who was this person who enabled these miracles with God? There was such curiosity about Moses from the time. Therefore, one Arabian king decided to send his royal artist to portray Moses' image and bring it to him, meaning to go and paint a picture of Moses. Then they didn't have Polaroids or selfies. They sent a painter. And what was the idea? There was a skill at the time that you could understand the psychology of a person based on the picture that you see of them. So when he brought back the picture, the king gathered all the occult scholars of the realm, and he asked them to analyze the physiognomy before them and reconstruct all his character traits for the purpose of discerning whence his power derived. I didn't write this. It's somebody else's retelling of this teaching. Meaning their task was to look at this picture, focus on it. Who is this guy Moses? Okay. Well, they came as a group before the king and said, if we were to report on this famous man as portrayed in this painting, we'd have to declare that this is an extraordinarily evil individual. He is arrogant. His traits include vanity, avarice, cold-heartedness, in short, all the negative traits in the world. Emphasizing, by the way, in the original text, again, this is a summary, this person is so self-interested, so arrogant, so about himself. The king said to these scholars, what are you talking about? The one thing apparently we know about this Moses fellow is the opposite, that he's known as the most humble of all. And he said, therefore, all of you are obviously lousy at your job. And they said, we're not, we're reading the picture correctly. And some kind of tension arose between the king and these scholars. The king who burned to know the truth traveled to the camp of Israel in the desert. He went with cavalry and chariots and entered the camp. And upon his entry, he saw Moses, the man of God, in the distance. He rushed up to him, pulling out the picture as he went. And the fact is that Moses looked identical to the picture. And the king's heart fell. It's like, how could it be that all this talk of Moses was so humble when my scholars tell me that a man looking like this is somebody profoundly arrogant? Continues this rabbinic teaching again. This is a late rabbinic teaching of which some strongly dispute its authenticity, but still, I think it's fascinating. He approached Moses, bowed before him, related all that had transpired. He said, at first I thought the artist missed a true image, but now I see he hit the mark. So it must be that my scholars have failed me. What did Moses say to this king? No, your painter did a great job, and your scholars are right. He said, the truth is, though, I was born with arrogant tendencies. I was born as somebody who was not humble. But though that was my nature, I've worked to change myself. With great strength, I've combated and defeated them until I've acquired for myself an opposite second nature. And it's for this very reason I'm respected both in heaven above and earth below. Which means, according to this teaching, the celebration of Moses being humble isn't just that he was humble. It's he was humble even though when he was younger, he was lesser. Now, again, I'm by no means suggesting one should treat this text as anything more than an interesting myth. Even the greatest of rabbis from whom revere this author do nothing more than that. But I mention it because I find it fascinating. We often think that some people are born humble and some people are born arrogant, and never the twain shall meet. Whereas this tradition suggests that Moses worked on becoming who he was. And there was something really quite remarkable about the idea that humility isn't something you're necessarily born with, it's something that we have to foster. And that Moses was somebody who, don't forget, he grew up in an Egyptian palace, a place where ego was all around. And still, he was able to refine himself in this way, thus leading to this conclusion that he looked one way, but in fact was very different. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. I was thinking about doing breakout rooms, but I'm aware of time and perhaps it wouldn't be advisable right now. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about this story. I presume most of us haven't heard this story. Some of you may find it abhorrent and think that's ridiculous. That's totally fine. Most rabbis think that as well. But some of you may think it curious. Again, it doesn't matter what its provenance is. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Whoever's first.
Okay. It's very interesting that it was a picture, was an image that he gave to his servants it said a cult leaders or whatever, to find out. And it's very interesting how often we judge on an image of what somebody looks like, or without knowing them at all, actually. We can make very quick judgments. But I find that something very interesting, the word that is being chosen tonight, anav, the root of it, also has to do with affliction. And when we look at the character of Moshe Rabbeinu, we know this is a man who definitely was used affliction to his advantage. He forged a character that God could use to take an entire nation out of Egypt through his suffering. And I find too that meekness or humility is truly an attribute that is forged through the of negative encounters, and I don't want to just say suffering, but it's rejection. It's through so many different things that are the exact opposite of what we want to be or think we are, or, we don't want to experience these things. We want, to accomplish without going through this, but it's so much a part of the process. And so I love the story because I really think it represents very clearly these two sides of what people, initially think of you and how they judge you, and then who you are through this crucible we call life to create this beautiful character called humility. So
thank you, and thank you for expressing that so beautifully. Anybody else? Again, feel free to remark in which way you'd like.
Johnny, I think that Moses says that he was born arrogant and he became humble. And it speaks to me of the fact that we can change, that we're not bound by our environment, by the situation we grew up in, by the abuse that we've endured from people, by the experiences we've had that are unfair. We can change and become something that we were not, based on how we grew up or how we were born. And I don't think there are very many religions that see, well, very many people, I should say, that see that this order of change is possible. And it's very hopeful to say, yes, we can change.
Firstly, I love that. And I'll add just a quick remark, because I'll add two things, I think, which are highly relevant. Just in terms of the biblical traditions, there are occasions where certain biblical figures do things which appear to us to be wrong. And the Jewish biblical tradition of commentary often reads these events differently. Some say that person didn't do anything wrong. That person could never do anything wrong. That person was perfect. You've misunderstood them. And there are other commentaries who say, no, they did something wrong and they regretted it and then they grew from it. And we have these parallel traditions, some which are very emphatic in defending the image of a biblical personality. And others who say, well, the text says they did something wrong, so we should accept it as that. Why are we told this story about human growth? That's the first point. Second point, more recently, within trends in Jewish literature, where biographies have been written of holy men and holy women, certainly in recent decades, there's been a desire to often kind of airbrush the bad things out of their lives, make it seem as if they were born great and perfect and saintly, and they continue to live great and perfect and saintly. Just as much as people like airbrushing pictures to make themselves look beautiful in magazines, these biographies have tried to airbrush any kind of paints in their lives to make these holy people seem perfect. And there was a pushback of that in the Orthodox Jewish world, where people said, that's not helpful. First, it's not quite true. Most people make mistakes. We have it in the book of Ecclesiastes. There's no righteous person on earth that doesn't sin. And so how are we helping by misrepresenting the idea that every person is born perfect and never makes mistakes? Actually, far more useful is to tell a more realistic story. And the son of a very saintly rabbi decided, therefore, to write a very long book of lots of stories of his father and his friends, highlighting their mistakes and saying, look, my father and his friends made mistakes, and they were great. What was ironic was, within the Jewish world, that book was banned. It's like, how dare you highlight the errors of people's ways? Surely we should be emphasizing their perfections. But as part of his argument, he referred to this story. He said, no, truth be told, to be a servant of God is to stumble, sometimes to make mistakes, to learn from those errors and to grow. And this is what this story is coming to teach, whether or not, again, it's authoritative or not. That even the greatest of people, even Moses himself, absent of this teaching, we know it already in the Bible, made errors. And there's something actually quite remarkable about a Bible that doesn't hide, that doesn't airbrush the mistakes of others, but actually says people grew from them, they learned from them. That's why the Bible still remains so profoundly meaningful and relevant to all of us. It speaks to our frailties. It highlights mistakes of people far greater than us, so that when we fall, when we stumble, we don't feel like fools. Instead, we emulate their journey of penance, of repentance, of growth, and of repair. So this story really captures the ethic, the teaching, the approach, I think, which is reflected throughout the Bible, of individuals who make mistakes because they're human, or who are born with certain tendencies, but who work through it, who grow through it. And in so doing, demonstrate to us that truly somebody who yearns for the godly path is somebody who finds their way through the challenging path of the stumbling blocks ahead of them. is able to overcome those stumbling blocks for the sake of self-improvement and better servanthood of God. Any further thoughts on this before we start looking and leaping towards the book of Proverbs, the book of Mishlei?
I would just like to say, Rav, that, and I think some of the greatest experiences of revelation and learning has certainly come in some of my greatest hardships that I've had to experience. Some of them were my own mistakes, though. But yet, as it says there, and I with great strength, I would believe that even in this scenario here, that the great strength didn't necessarily come from themselves. It may have come, for me, I would describe that great strength as the God who I believe is living in me now, that has given me the courage, which I think is found in this word humility as well, to be able to combat and defeat them. But I think that's only one depth. I think another depth that perhaps might be deeper is when you have a choice to go one way or another, and you're able to use that courage to submit to the direction that strength is taking you, which might not be your first choice, if you understand what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm. And with you, I think it takes courage to acknowledge that perhaps we've traversed the wrong path, and we'd like to find our way back to choose an alternative. Too many people,
even not to take, I don't mean just not to take the wrong path. That's one place of humility, but a place where you haven't even determined to take a particular path, but yet that strength within you says, I'm calling you into this path. And then a choice and a decision has to be made, and it might not be the most popular path to take.
Right, and we spoke about that last time. Do you remember the idea of being bold as a leopard to serve the Creator? Sometimes you have to have a certain inner strength, which we draw, of course, from the strength of God, to begin those journeys and continue those paths, even though others perhaps may not necessarily applaud us the way we know we should be.
Exactly.
Okay, well, sorry, yes.
I would just like to suggest that there might be a horizontal dimension to this humility. In fact, when you had the verse, Anav Mikol Adam, you actually had it twice.
Yes, one was
here in the last.
It was written in one way and enunciated differently.
Right.
Yes.
And the way it's written, it's anu. It's actually plural. And I seem to feel in some ways that I remember when Dean used to talk to me about how we have to be a light unto nations, and I would feel, my goodness, how can I be a light unto nations? Who am I to become a light unto nations? And it very often I find myself saying, if we can learn from each other, if we can really find the light in each of us, in each of the others, and bring that light into our world, then that would be a light unto nations. Because one of the biggest problems that we have in the world today is that there are so many people out there who seem to think that they have all the light necessary for the rest of the world because they know best, better than anyone else. And in fact, it's from those people that we typically don't want to really get much light because we feel that they are too arrogant and they are not humble enough to really bring like Moses. But what we really need are people who, there's this great scene in the movie called Avatar where the natives say, what these human beings that have come to this planet couldn't possibly learn anything from us because they see themselves as full. They already know everything. And it was actually the person there who said, I'm empty. He was acceptable to them because he was open to learning. So I really, really believe that there's this horizontal aspect of humility, which has not just us vis-a-vis God, but us vis-a-vis the people around us, recognizing that there is an image of God in everybody around us. And for us to be able to accept that light, that image of God, the light of the image of God around us, we have to be humble, because if we don't, we'll never really pay attention to anybody else's light. And it's perhaps an ability to bring all of the different faces of God together to light each other, that we can really become a true light unto nations.
Beautiful. We are all torches, and together we beam. And I think that's really what eNoam is all about. Each of us are sparks of holiness, and by coming together, we can shine a light of goodness on this world. We can also shine a light on ways we can all do better. Sorry, is somebody speaking now? I can hear some feedback.
I think Lily was speaking.
No, feel free, please. Lily?
An accident.
Okay. Oh, if Lily or if anybody else would like to speak up, feel free to do so. What I want to do, though, only because I'm aware of time, is just look at one or two more teachings, both from the rabbinic tradition and the biblical tradition. This is from an ethical master living about 1,000 years ago, Rabbi Bachya ben Joseph ibn Pekuda from Spain. And he says something quite remarkable, that the type of humility the Torah advocates, the Bible advocates, comes only after one realizes how elevated one really is. Then there is value to humility. A lack of this awareness is not a virtue, but a major fault. And this, by the way, I think helps us make sense of what does it mean to be humble. It does not mean overlook, to be dismissive, and to fail to harness the divinely given qualities that each and every one of us have. It's to know that those qualities that we have are divinely given. And once you recognize they're divinely given, you use them in tandem to your ultimate mission you feel God has given you. The ultimate mission, which, as I say, you've responded to through your very being in the answer, here I am, hineni. But let's now look at a different verse. And this comes from the book of Proverbs, the book of Mishlei, where we're told something quite curious. And if you recall, I included this in the teaser video. It says, in the wake of humility comes fear of the Lord, which is kind of expected. That's good. Humility fosters fear of God. Then it goes on to say, Osher v'chavod b'chaim, riches, honor, and life. And that's quite unexpected. Why would humility enable, why would it trigger, why would it bring about riches and honor and life? And that was a question which I asked you. What is the logic of rewarding someone who is humble and avoids honor with honor? Just think about the verse. It's basically saying somebody who runs away from honor, somebody who is humble, we're going to give you honor. It's like, exactly. It's like somebody who is an alcoholic. You give them a bottle of wine, say, Kol hakavod, well done. You think, that's exactly what I don't want. So I would like to hear your thoughts, if possible. What do you think is the meaning of this verse? What do you think is the meaning of Proverbs 22:4, which informs us that in the wake of humility comes fear of the Lord, riches, honor, and life? Why would one be rewarded with the things they are avoiding? Unless perhaps these are metaphorical. Maybe riches, honor, or life are speaking about something different. Any thoughts?
I'd like to throw out a thought.
I think.
Go ahead, Jonathan.
Sorry. So I think when you said that he's rewarded with honor, I don't think that means that he specifically is rewarded with honor, but we are respecting him, respecting what he presents. That's the honor. I mean, we are honoring his qualities, not himself, not his not himself, just what he's presenting. And since he's humble, so it won't change him. We can be sure that it won't change him in a good way. I mean, Like maybe it will change somebody who is, not humble.
I understand. So you're saying this isn't that he's receiving honor, but nevertheless, this is a perception of him as being honorable. That, by the way, there's a similar rabbinic teaching which says somebody who runs away from honor pursues them, which is a really lovely idea. Sorry, Gabriel, you were going to say?
Well, I was just going to say that Dean hinted at something earlier that I thought might play into this verse with respect to the idea that embedded in the concept of humility is the requirement for courage. And that I think one way I can think of humility is the courage to fail, the courage to make mistakes,
Absolutely,
the courage to be flawed and yet to be seen, right? And that in the tail end of this verse, in the wake of humility comes fear of the Lord, riches, honor, and life. I would think that for those who are willing to fail, for those who are willing to be shown to be flawed before others, they're the ones typically who are going to take risks that can yield life giving activities or wealth generating activities, or they're people who stand out to others and therefore receive honor from them because all of a sudden you notice someone who's courageous and willing to fail in front of others.
Right. I think that idea. I did like Dean's mention of the concept of courage. And I think humility and courage often aren't, used in the same sentence. We think they're very, very different traits. But I think there is as a courage to be the flawed individuals that we are and go on a journey of growth. And that's really what humility is all about. Somebody who is prepared to become more than who they are. And in so doing, acknowledge that who they are isn't quite yet who they want to be. So I think that's lovely. And I believe also, I agree with you that if you take that path, if you go down that journey, many rewards can come to you in many different ways. With that in mind, aware of time, as I mentioned, I'd like to share with you an interpretation of this verse. And this comes from one further rabbinic collection. This is from a more modern teacher called Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, who lived in the 19th century in Germany. He has a lovely commentary on the book of Proverbs called From the Wisdom of Mishlei. I have it here, actually. And what's great is rather than it being a verse by verse commentary, it's thematic. So he deals with humility and pride in the book of Proverbs. He deals with language and speech in the book of Proverbs and gives a variety of different explanations. And I really am a big fan of him and also of especially this book. And I want to at least briefly read the first couple of paragraphs, not all of this, it's long, but the first couple of paragraphs where he really addresses this question we've mentioned, which is, what is the meaning of receiving riches, honor, and life in response to humility? He says, our holy scriptures know of no higher, more nobling virtue than anava, which is the Hebrew for humility, the mentality residing in the profoundness of the spirit, which is totally unconscious of its own importance. Whatever the humble person may be, possess, desire, accomplish, is never his own making. It is exclusively by product of a higher being, as suggested. Himself he considers a creature created by the one and only God as his child and servant. The word I emphatically spoken is completely strange to his trend of thought and mentality. Please note, so much of what he says here is what we've touched upon. How somebody who's humble doesn't place the I at the center of their universe. He goes on to say, according to our Proverbs, the immediate effect of anava, of humility, is yirat Hashem, the fear of God. In the center of a person's inner conviction, fear of God is actually synonymous with humility, not merely its consequence. In fact, humility without fear of God is entirely inconceivable. On the contrary, humility is a purest expression of true fear. But in the sense of the stamp upon a life led in obedience to God, fear of God is a direct consequence of humility, which automatically resolves itself into the fulfillment of God's will. Now I'm just going to read one more partial paragraph. Fear of God, however, is not the only consequence of humility. Our Proverbs also mention riches, honor, and life. Even though nothing is further from the direct intention and endeavors of the humble person than obtaining such goods. If a person is called rich when he reaches what he desires, then riches, honor, and life are the natural consequence and logical reward of humility. Quote from the ethical Proverbs of the Fathers: "Who is satisfied with what which is allotted to them is rich." It feels that the humblest person on earth is also the richest one, not monetarily. What is richness? True richness is being satisfied. And so the verse in Proverbs, in the wake of humility comes fear of the Lord, even riches and honor and life. A person who's humble doesn't feel they're lacking. That means they're rich. A person who's humble feels that they get all the respect they need. That means they're honored. A person who's humble is living in alignment with the will of God, which means they have life. And I think what Rabbi Hirsch says here is truly magnificent. What it does is highlight how anava, humility, really is the basis of all morality, of the pursuit for the ethical life, of the pursuit for the godly life. And if a person makes that commitment towards humility, even if that's not their natural tendency, and turns their life around while recognizing their qualities, turns their life around while recognizing that whatever they think of themselves needs to be in relation to their relationship with God, then they are ultimately blessed, they're ultimately rewarded with the greatest of gifts of satisfaction, of a sense of purpose and place, and of a meaningful life. So I believe humility is really a very, very important concept of quality in the biblical tradition, in the Jewish tradition, I think in the human condition, one which is often overlooked, but one which certainly deserves to be revisited again. I'd love to hear any further thoughts you may have, but I very much appreciate your remarks. I'm just looking through right now the chat. Just because God puts us in a place of power, authority, stature, does not mean that we are not to exercise humility, even if our culture suggests that we are superior, which is absolutely right. And as mentioned, it takes courage for an addict to admit their addiction when they do not, and when they do, they're rewarded with a more fruitful life. I think all of us are called upon to acknowledge both our strengths and our weaknesses, both what we have and what we don't. We're called upon to come near to the light, and in so doing, recognize who we are when we stand under the great being called God. By recognizing both our greatness and our smallness, our qualities and our limitations, that's where we find life, and that's where we ultimately connect with the truest mission called our life. Those are my ramblings for today. Apologies for rambling on. And thank you for all your great wisdom that you shared and from which I've learned. Anybody else want to finish off? You're more than welcome to do so. But thank you all.
I'll throw in a comment. I think humility is recognizing the difference between ends and means. That when we make some of these things our goal and pursue them, we have the wrong focus because we're making ends important. And when we recognize that these things happen as byproducts, they're not the goal we're after. It's these things happen along the way when we're pursuing the right things. And if we're pursuing God and his character and trying to live that out in our lives, then we will be recognized as humble people, servants. Those are my comments.
Well, firstly, Rick, I think that's beautiful. And actually what you've just done is make sense of the criticism directed by Aaron and Miriam towards Moses, because to use your language, they saw his act of separation from his wife as an end. And they said, what are you doing? You know, other people don't need to do that. And he was saying, that's not the end, it's the means for a higher purpose, which perhaps may not apply to you, but certainly applies to me. They were seeing it as the destination. He was seeing it as a path. And they couldn't see that there was virtue in his foregoing of a physical relationship with his wife. Whereas he said, in my position, there is meaning behind it. And they then learned from him what it means to be a servant of God. Give up those things for reasons beyond those things. So thank you so much for explaining that to me.
I want to add something. We know that according to Jewish tradition, Moses is the one who wrote the Torah, right? God spoke to him and Moses wrote it down. So I'm just wondering to myself, how did he feel when he was writing the sentence about himself that he is the humblest man? I mean, how can you write something like that about yourself? Even if God is the one telling you to write it down, it must have been very weird thing to write about yourself.
I guess that's where humility must come in. You need to be prepared to write your own obituary and tell the truth, which is, you know, I'll tell you, if just to excuse it for one second, a quick story. There was a court case in the 1960s, if I recall, or 70s in the UK. Basically, there are laws from the Bible about how animals are slaughtered, and a certain butcher felt that the rabbis had made a wrong decision. He felt he made the right decision. In the end, it went to a very senior court in England, and they brought as an expert witness the head of the London Beth Din, the head of the Jewish court in London, called Dayan Yechezkel Abramsky, who was a really brilliant Talmud scholar. And the judge said to Dayan Abramsky, and this is recorded, it's fascinating, he said, Dayan Abramsky, apparently, is it true that you are one of the great world experts in the Talmud and Torah? And Dayan Abramsky said, yes. To which the judge said, I understood your religion to be one in which you emphasized humility. How can you agree with me? So he said, because I'm under oath. You asked me to tell the truth. So what do you want from me? Now, there was a strange moment, but took place in a courtroom. And this was not an arrogant rabbi in the slightest, but when a person is asked to write their truth, when you're bound by your oath of telling the truth in the court, or Moses, of writing the truth in the Bible, even if it's awkward, sometimes you have to say what's true. And Dayan Abramsky did that in the British court. I think Moses did it in the Book of Numbers.
I just wanted to mention that some explain that the Torah had to be given via a person like Moshe Rabbeinu because of his humility, because very often when we receive something, we always add some element of ourself into what we're passing on to others. And his humility was such that he could truly pass on the message, the revelation of God, without his ego becoming part of that process, but really to pass it on purely. And
beautiful.
I was just going to throw in that he was probably working with a team of scribes, and the moment he stepped out of the tent to get a drink, they decided to slip it in. So that was just my theory. Moshe wouldn't say it, but we can.
Right. Very, very true.
Okay. Oh.
Go ahead, Kim.
No, what I was going to say is I think what always strikes me about Moshe Rabbeinu is when he was faced with these massive challenges and criticized in such a humiliating way, and publicly very often, his response always appears to be, he would fall on his face before Hashem, and he would take the situation to Hashem so he could find out exactly how he should handle it. And this consistency in the story is, I think, what gave him the meekness and the humility, because he didn't respond. And when he did, the one time he responded out of his own emotion when he's hit that rock, and he was not supposed to. You see the consequence of that. But when he would allow those emotions to be redirected to Hashem, he once again would then reflect not just his humility, but the humility of God himself. And I think, every trait Hashem, reveals to us is a trait that he carries with him himself. And so we strive for that. So that was.
Thanks, Kim.
Beautiful.
So with that, I think we're gonna wrap up and let all of you go on to your embittered lives, hopefully inspired to sink in some of this character trait, see how you can exude it in your life. And we will be back together soon. And we'll be in touch by email. We'll send you the next invitation. Hope you enjoyed today's discussion. And we'll have 2 breakout sessions next week just to make up for the
Yes,
one.
apologies. I'm sorry. There came a point where it just made sense to continue going. But still, okay. Next time, I
That's just
agree.
my taunt. It's good.
Everybody's here, so we're good.
Everybody,
So we're
thank you,
told-
Rav Johnny.
Thank you so much, Rav Johnny.
Real
Pleasure.
quick,
Take care,
how many
everyone.
of
I
you?
really appreciate you, Rav. God bless you. God bless
My
everyone.
pleasure. And thank you, Pastor Silva, for joining us.
Oh,
Bye-bye.
it was wonderful.
I mean,
Thanks, Rav Johnny.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.